Hello and welcome to the first episode of Unravel. Today I'm joined by Mark Darcy. He's been a correspondent for the Today in Parliament series since 2002, and he also presents BBC Parliament's political book review show called Book Talk. All in all, he is the perfect person to help us unravel the true nature of UK Parliament. So we'll talk about health, Mrs. Darcy. Matt Hancock has called for people to take more initiative and greater responsibility on their own personal health and put greater emphasis on prevention rather than the cures. Do you think that this would be a possible and viable solution to the failures of the NHS?
Well, the NHS, of course, has many successes as well, but the difficulty is having a service that's configured so that you kind of rock up to a hospital and require treatment for a serious health problem. It's like having a car and doing no maintenance, or letting the roof of your house get full of holes before you address a problem. And common sense for people who want to lead good, healthy lives, I think almost anybody in politics would agree, involves looking after yourself, not eating yourself to obesity, not drinking yourself to liver disease, not smoking yourself to a heart attack. And people talk about, one of the standard responses is we don't want nanny statism, we don't want the state sitting over people, but no one complains it's the nanny state when they rock up at a consultant's office needing several hundred grams worth of treatment every year to keep them alive from then on in. So you can come at that from both sides. The NHS is a very expensive beast. The NHS is now eating up, getting on for 40% of total government spending. That's a very, very large proportion of everything the British state does. Some people are beginning to say that's an unsustainable amount of the public purse. So finding ways to reduce the problems that have to be brought to the NHS to deal with is an obvious part of that solution. And a lot of it is quite low tech. Walk more, eat more sensibly. So no one's talking about vast differences to the way people live, but just doing things that promote a slightly more healthy outcome, riding a bike.
I mean, you talked about spending there. So the NHS has cut £1 billion worth of spending in the last year. So is lecturing people about their personal habits really a serious plan to tackle the NHS failures?
It can't just be a lecture about personal habits. It's got to be getting people to see how best to look after themselves. And there are various things that are beyond people's control. Air quality in London is not necessarily within the control of an individual. Best you can do is shut the window and hope the fumes don't get in for some people. But there are things you can do. Don't drink, smoke, or eat to excess. All those kind of things are fairly simple. Find ways of avoiding sort of communicable diseases. Those kind of things are fairly simple and straightforward. And if people do them, there would doubtless be fewer problems. But beyond that, I think that the future of the NHS is caught up in finding ways to manage chronic illness that don't break the national bank.
So with items and commodities such as cigarettes and alcohol, do you believe that there should be, the government should put more emphasis on targeting suppliers? So for example, by implementing strong regulations and taxes on these types of products to ensure that, for example, consumers don't have availability or access to these types of goods?
I think most people in Parliament would probably think it's excessive to just stop people from having access to cigarettes or whiskey or donuts if they wanted them. You can't police people to that degree. I'm sure that would be the universal view in Parliament. It's not for me to say the government's taxing cigarettes or spirits too much or too little. What's clear is that health requires people to look after themselves and take sensible decisions about themselves. Taxes are only a way of sending a signal in some ways, although these days the cost of cigarettes or alcohol is quite a lot of it is now tax. But at the same time, the real bottom line here has got to be individuals taking sensible decisions about their own health and their own future, because the long-term effects of behaviours may not show up for a while. But if you want to spend your middle age and later years with congestive heart failure or lung disease, it probably completely destroys your quality of life. So it's self-interest to make sure that you are a healthy person for as long as you possibly can be.
Because of course, recently we've seen the Scottish government adopt minimum prices on alcohol. Do you believe that it would be? Do you believe that it would be possible for the government to adopt such a strategy?
I think that people will be watching quite closely. One of the things about devolution is it allows different health policies to be kind of road tested in different places without going live across the whole country. And so I think people will watch very closely. And one of the things that's going on at the moment, for example, is that a law on deemed consent for transplant organs. So you assume that people are happy to donate, you know, their heart or their lungs or their kidneys in the event of their death, unless they basically have registered to say otherwise. That's something that's been tried in Wales, and it's now being tried. And there's a law now to bring that in England as well. And that's quite an interesting example of how these things have been tried out in one place. And people have thought, well, maybe that works, so we'll try it here as well. So that's one way to approach these things. I mean, the government will doubtless be watching very closely what the impact of minimum pricing is, because there have been all sorts of arguments about whether or not it's a good idea or not. But government is looking for proactive health measures. If they think it works in one place, they might be very tempted to try it.
So you talked about some of the benefits of policy divergence in areas such as Scotland and Wales. Could you give us some examples of failures of this devolutionary processes such as policy divergence?
Not off the top of my head, actually. Not off the top of my head. I mean, I don't follow on a day-to-day basis. I happen to know that one because it's been discussed a lot in Parliament. There's a different model for the running of the NHS in Wales as compared to England, and Conservatives often get up and criticise the way that Labour have run the NHS in Wales. How valid those criticisms are, I simply don't know. In a lot of cases, there are differences of emphasis that one thing maybe worked in a different way as compared to England. But I'm not an expert on that, really can't easily comment.
Of course. So let's move on now to universal credit. What exactly is this?
The idea is to try and get a kind of precision engineered benefit system that always is so configured that you don't get worse off by working. One of the problems with a very complicated system, and universal credit replaces, I think off the top of my head, 13 different benefits, including housing, to some extent housing benefit. One of the problems is that the benefit system has been so complicated that if you're unemployed and then get a job, you may find yourself actually worse off because you lose some or all of the benefits that you've previously been getting. And so that discourages people from getting into work. And that is seen to be, by the government, a bad thing in the sense that you're trying to encourage work in families so that people don't grow up in workless families and don't get the idea of working. And the fear is that otherwise you create some kind of permanent workless stratum of society. That's the theory behind it. The practice is fabulously, fantastically difficult because you're trying to, in effect, have a sort of real-time reaction to the changing circumstances of individuals. So someone who's in a temporary job that ends unexpectedly, you've got to be able to adapt immediately so the benefits click on and off as you go in and out of work.
Of course.
Or reduce according to the amount of salary you've got and react to a salary increase. And that is far more complicated in practice than just saying it. I remember being at a session of the Work and Pensions Select Committee where they were taking evidence from the people who were doing the rollout, as it's described in universal credit, because it's being spread from place to place, who had this terrifying piece of jargon about successfully landing the 9 strands of the rollout in the 8 regional centres where the claimants had been lobster potted. And as the entire room reeled at this piece of sort of monstrous management babble, you began to get an idea of the sheer complexity of what's being attempted here. Now, 21st century information technology makes this possible in a way that, a sort of paper-based, get a stamp, go and join another queue to apply for the next benefit kind of system that would have pervaded in the 60s or 70s wouldn't have been able to cope with that level of continuous real-time adjustment. But it's not clear that it's that easy for people to do, even with all the technological bells and whistles that are being put onto this. The computer programming has to be fantastically complicated. The people operating the system have to know what they're doing. The claimants have to understand what they can and can't claim for and how the system works. And it can all get extraordinarily fraught, and is. And the charge that's being made now is that you can float off a lot of the anomalies and problems about the ways that the benefits work by having enough money in the system and a sufficient level of, as it were, generosity in the benefits, that people aren't suddenly plunged into losing out by the sort of ebbs and flows of this system. And that money was taken away in earlier budgets and needs to be put back. Otherwise, you are making people seriously worse off. I mean, it's a huge ongoing political controversy. And Labour, I think, sent a certain amount of blood around this and think that the problems are so serious now that the government is in real trouble on the issue. Whether it is or not, they've got to be able to make it work. And part of the way you make it work is you pump a lot of money in.
I believe Mr. Hammond allocated £1 billion to the transactional costs of the Universal Benefit Scheme. Do you think this will be enough to appease the Labour Party?
I don't know if, I mean, there are two questions. One is whether it's enough to make the system work, and another is whether politically you diffuse the row that way. I don't know on either. I'm not an expert on the scheme. I've seen people talking about it a lot. But it is an issue where you will get hammered if people are demonstrably being made worse off for a very long time and the government knows that it's got problems here. It also thinks and defends the scheme on the grounds that it does incentivise people to get into work and doesn't force them to stay where they are because they get worse off if they took a low-paid job as opposed to being on benefits. And that's where a lot of the argument floats around.
So let's get on to Brexit. What is this meaningful vote that everyone's talking about?
The idea right at the start of when the government started to pass the laws that will make Brexit possible was to insert in the middle of it a kind of trigger mechanism. You wouldn't be able to start using the laws that enable you to reshape European law that operates in Britain until you'd achieved the consent in part of Parliament for the settlement you've reached. And that was called the meaningful vote. It's a slightly horrible phrase, but the powers that the government has to fully implement Brexit can't kick in until Parliament's given its assent. So the mechanism for doing that is called the meaningful vote. It depends who you ask what the meaningful vote means, if indeed it means anything. First of all, the legislation requires the government to put down a motion that the House approves the deal. What's difficult is that you are attempting, if you don't approve the deal, to backseat drive an international negotiation. The House can say, the House of Commons can say that it wants this or that from the Brexit negotiations, but it can't guarantee it gets them. Right. The House of Commons can't tell the European Commission that it must grant this. It can say, we want this, or we insist on this, and we'll walk away without this, but it can't say, you must grant it, because it simply physically doesn't have the power so to do. Right. So that's one of the complexities in it. Second is just the sheer practicality of the House of Commons, 642 MPs sitting in the Commons, trying to backseat drive an international negotiation, even in terms of telling British negotiators what they ought to be aiming for. That becomes problematic as well in the real world. But at the same time, Brexit is the biggest deal there is in British politics. And if the idea of Brexit is for Parliament to take back control, the argument is made Parliament ought to have a voice in this process. So the idea of the meaningful vote was to provide a mechanism where Parliament could essentially send the government back to say, no, we want something different on, I don't know, fisheries. Or no, we want something different on this, or no, we want something different on that, or alternatively impose conditions on the deal, like, okay, but only subject to a further referendum is the one that a lot of people are beginning to talk about. The difficulty with all that is that what we're then talking about is a procedural wrinkle in all this, that this is resolutions of the House of Commons. They are expressions of opinion. They are not law. It's just that what's happened is you passed a motion saying this House say that there should be a second referendum. That doesn't mean a second referendum then happens. Right. To have a second referendum, you then have to pass an act of Parliament that says that there's going to be a second referendum. And that's a whole different thing. So essentially, there's no force behind a lot of the votes around the meaningful votes on a strict legal level. There's a different thing about the political. If there is a majority in the House of Commons that passes a resolution saying we want a second referendum, then presumably the votes exist to translate that into a law saying let's have a second referendum. Right. It's just not the two are not the same thing. Now, between passing the resolution and attempting to pass the law, you might get people getting peeled off. Yeah. So that majority might then melt away. So those are the kind of things that are going on in the background. People are trying to think about this. But one of the points about it is just because Parliament has voted for something, it doesn't mean it happens. Yeah. You only get something to happen if you pass a law. Okay, right. So, of course, with the meaningful vote, there have been some issues surrounding the actual procedure and the practicalities, which you touched upon. Could you elaborate on these? Because I believe the meaningful vote has been going through a procedural select committee phase now. Yeah, what's happening at the moment is that the Commons Procedure Committee is trying to broker an agreed way of taking this vote. Everyone says, okay, these are the ground rules, let's do it this way. Because actually, spookily enough, the Parliament doesn't have a sort of set template of rules that fits this occasion. Normally, when they're voting on orders under an international agreement, I think it's a 90-minute debate followed by a one-off vote.
Yeah.
Now, that's clearly not adequate for the sheer scale and complexity and importance of this. You're potentially looking at a 2 or 3 day debate with amendments flying in all directions. So you've got to deliver, first of all, a set of rules about how we'll have this debate in Parliament, and then you've got to have a look at the actual structure of the decision that's being made. One of the issues is that the government thinks that the law requires, under the meaningful vote amendments that were passed last year, a clean vote on the government's deal. So Parliament has to vote to accept it or reject it.
Okay.
And then afterwards, and then only afterwards, should they have votes on, oh, but it should be subject to a referendum, or oh, but we want something different on fisheries, or oh, but we want something on free movement.
Right.
But the difficulty with that is that the government could then take that first vote, yes or no on the deal, has all the approval it needs to plunge ahead, and essentially ignore the rest because they're resolutions.
Right.
They're an expression of opinion, they're not the law.
Right.
Whether it would dare to do that because there'd be a political majority behind those resolutions that would cause it trouble later is a second point. But there's a lot of difficulty around this. But I slightly wonder if tempers are slightly boiling because people hadn't quite understood this point when they got into this.
Okay, right.
I mean, we're very deep down the rabbit hole of Commons procedure here.
I mean, you mentioned some of the amendments to the EU withdrawal bill. Could you give us some more?
The EU withdrawal bill is a extraordinarily simple idea, really, and that we've got almost 40 years worth of European law out there that's sort of accreted in Britain like sort of coral or something, growing and growing and growing. Over the years, we've been members of the EU and its predecessor organisations. And actually, you can't just wave a hand and get rid of that stuff. I mean, it covers things like, recycling and data protection, and a whole load of stuff that we didn't have laws on before we went into the EU pretty much at all. Because, a whole load of things have grown up since then, particularly on the internet, that simply didn't exist in 1972. So if you get rid of all those laws, suddenly you have no laws in a whole areas of human activity, and that's not really a sensible way to proceed. So the idea is that you translate all of EU law into British law, and then you give ministers powers to get rid of the bits they don't like later.
Right. And in practice, how difficult is that really?
Well, that's a task of decades. Unpicking some of this stuff. I mean, you may end up living with laws that you probably wouldn't have passed yourself, but are better than not having a law at all for a while, until you can get around to it. There'll be a sort of long hurry. There will be things that the country will need to do pretty well immediately. It will need to have an immigration system in place. It will need to have an alternative way of handling agricultural subsidies that used to come from the EU under the Common Agricultural Policy that we paid into and then got the money back out again. So a whole load of complexities like that. Some are more urgent than others. But there's just such a vast tonnage of this stuff out there that it'll be a very long time being unpicked.
Right. Let's talk about the actual intricacies of the deal here. So what is this backstop everyone's talking about in regard to Northern Ireland?
Well, the idea is that we simultaneously want Northern Ireland to be outside of the European Customs Union and the European Single Market, and continue to have an open border, so that there aren't sort of border posts and barbed wire and guards at every little sort of crossing point in Northern Ireland. And that's a very important part of sustaining the peace deal in Northern Ireland, so that it could respect both, as it were, nationalist and unionist identities. And so nobody wants border posts to come back. But how do you enforce a customs border without there being a border? And that's the circle people are trying to square. There are all sorts of ways of attempting to do this using technological solutions and stuff like that. And the backstop idea is the idea of keeping this is all based on a promise Theresa May gave right at the start of the Brexit process, potentially keeping Northern Ireland somehow within the customs union until such time as a solution was found. The trouble with that is that if a solution isn't found, potentially the whole of Britain is in the customs union, or you create a border between Northern Ireland and Britain, at which point Unionists think you're splitting your Northern Ireland off from Britain, and next stop a united Ireland. So it's quite a conundrum to which some people believe that there's a technical fix that will sort it out quite seamlessly, and other people think that, fresh from its triumphs with other computer systems, the British government probably isn't the best place to try and implement that quickly.
So what is the actual problem with breaking up the constitutional integrity of the UK, in particular in regard to the DUP party?
Well, the U in DUP stands for Unionists. They want Northern Ireland to remain a part of Britain. And there are people in Northern Ireland who would like Northern Ireland to join the Irish Republic. And that, in a sense, the Northern Ireland Agreement to some degree splits the difference and allows people to look at their identity in a different way and hopefully avoid returning to the days when people were being shot at and bombed in these causes.
Right.
And that's an area of incredible sensitivity. And national identity is a very fundamental thing here. And you've got a solution at the moment that both communities in Northern Ireland had accepted and can live with and confirmed in a referendum. And there is this terrible fear that the Brexit process could in some way unpick that people are expressing. Now, some people simply deny this will happen. Some people think it's going to happen. But a fear doesn't have to be justified to exist in people's minds.
Right.
So whether you believe it or whether you don't, the fact is that there's a real concern there. And there's a lot of talk about no return to a hard border and no upsetting the constitutional settlement. And everyone's having to tiptoe around the additional complexities that Northern Ireland puts on this. And and these are not concocted fears. These are very sincere fears.
Yeah. And if Theresa May isn't able to appease parties such as the DUP, what will be the likely implications on the meaningful vote?
Well, that's a very interesting question. The DUP. As the DUP member said to me a while ago, the U stands for Unionist, and it's not there as a piece of decoration. They mean it. What do they do though? Because you're then faced with a dilemma about what do you do in circumstances where chucking out this government might not get you another government that would do the things you wanted to do anyway.
Right.
And that's an extremely you're into trying to calculate the consequences of an action that could have all sorts of implications.
How difficult is it passing through this constitutional alteration with Theresa May's minority government?
Well, that's one of the reasons Theresa May went for an election in 2017, is that she wanted the cushion of a good, healthy majority, and she didn't get it. Nice. And so, it's an incredibly difficult exercise in managing a kind of shifting coalition. Yeah. Where if you edge too far in any direction, you probably see some of your troops peeling off and being prepared to support amendments or vote against you in some way. Right. And trying to keep a very narrow majority on the road is fabulously difficult. It is, this is the sort of thing where, you could end up losing a vital vote because a train was late, or a plane from Scotland was delayed by fog, right, or something like that. Yeah. Or someone resigns and walks away in despair, and suddenly the mathematics looks completely different. So a huge kind of difficulties, and it's down to literally a matter of one or two MPs in some cases could make all the difference in some of these votes.
Right, so in the midst of Brexit, there's been talks and prospects of Labour possibly trying to force through a new general election. Is this a viable outcome?
Well, people used to talk about snap elections, and before 2010, it was possible for a Prime Minister to go to the Queen, request a dissolution of Parliament, and basically trigger an election more or less on their own. Right. Now we have a thing called the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which requires a supermajority of MPs to vote in favour of a general election. I mean, the lesson of 2017 was that actually it's quite hard for people to vote against a general election because they look frightened, I suppose. And so the government triggered a general election in what it thought were overwhelmingly favourable circumstances. And actually, to its surprise, and indeed to a lot of people's surprise, lost seats rather than gained them. At one point, everyone was assuming Theresa May was going to be at the head of some vast, formidable majority, which would mean she could more or less dictate the terms of Brexit and get them through Parliament. And now, instead, she's in this position where every half step you have to stop, look around, double check that your troops are still behind you.
Right.
And that's a very, very delicate and difficult position to be in for anyone.
And from your experience in Parliament, how likely is this no confidence motion likely to be passed?
Not at all at the moment, I don't think. I mean, if Labour would vote for it, the Conservatives probably wouldn't, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So it's not actually, strictly speaking, a no confidence motion. It's a motion to trigger a general election.
Okay,
I mean, there's a separate way of having a general election where a government collapses and no one else can put together a government within a fortnight, at which point the Speaker certifies that Parliament's deadlocked and then we're off to the races.
Yeah.
But Labour can put down no confidence motions till it's blue in the face, and the Conservatives will keep on voting against them. And it's a very, very heavy step for a Conservative MP to vote against their own government to trigger a general election.
Yeah.
It probably wouldn't be the Conservative candidate in the ensuing election were you so to do.
Yeah.
So that sort of thing keeps the tribes together quite neatly because it can all be dealt with in tribal terms.
Right.
What's really difficult for the government is Brexity issues, where people do split in along slightly different lines.
So how prominent are these rebels within the Conservative Party at the moment?
Well, there are some quite serious people. I mean, the former Chancellor and Home Secretary and multiple leadership contender Ken Clarke's one of the biggest names. But there are plenty of other people who are quite formidable ex-ministers who've been around the block, who know how to put a case. And the difficulty is, in a way, that the real insurgents in the Conservative Party are the people who've been arguing for Brexit for decades, right back to the major governments of the 90s in one form or another. This particular group and subsequent recruits have been arguing that we should either get out or renegotiate our relationship with Europe. And they know how to be an insurgency. They know the tricks of the trade. They're used to being rebels. They're used to getting the knock on the door in the night from the whips. They're used to being in trouble and and defying their party's authorities. The people who are now on this kind of soft Brexit wing, the Ken Clarkes, the Anake's, people like that, are basically an establishment that's trying to learn how to be an insurgency.
Right.
So they're having to sort of acquire new skills and ways of approaching things. Yeah. Whereas a lot of the Brexiteers are now in government and are having to learn how to be a government rather than an insurgency. So there's a certain elegance about that. But it's not so much the prominence that matters; it's the numbers. Okay. And the key lesson in politics is always count the numbers.
So that's down to parliamentary arithmetic.
It's down to parliamentary arithmetic. It's down to questions like. To defeat the government, you've got to line up almost everybody else against them.
Right. Okay.
In Parliament now, so you need to defeat the government, rebel Conservatives, all the other smaller parties, so Scottish Nationalists, Liberal Democrats, Independent Irish Unionists, Lady Sylvia Herman, the Green MP Caroline Lucas, and then the Labour Party has to show up en masse, and bits of the Labour Party mustn't flake off in order to get that kind of critical mass, or not much of it. Because one of the things that the Conservatives know may happen is that some pro-Brexit Labour MPs might end up voting with the government in certain circumstances on Brexit issues.
Okay, right.
So that kind of incredibly intricate balancing act is going on all the time.
Exactly. So the Brexit campaign and Lead EU have now faced fines totaling over £135,000 over breaches of data laws governing electronic marketing. What is the implications of this on our democracy today?
Well, there's there's a lot of stuff that was clearly going on in and around the referendum on the use of data that people have questioned. And there may be more to come. Investigations are still going on. The Information Commissioner was in front of a parliamentary committee earlier this week talking about how there's still an ongoing investigation into quite what was happening. There are two sets of questions here. One is what was actually going on, and we don't know yet. Two is that if untoward things were happening with the use of data, does it then invalidate the referendum result?
Right.
And that's almost impossible to answer.
Okay.
Nobody can prove to anybody else's satisfaction, I suspect, that online marketing by Leave.eu or anybody else was the decisive factor, and if only they hadn't done that, the result would have been different. And that's a very, very difficult area. And one of the reasons why this inquiry is becoming so sensitive is because I think some people want to see it as a way to overturn the referendum and want to be able to say, look, they broke the rules, this shouldn't stand. And I think an awful lot of other people are thinking, no, I don't. It wasn't enough to make a substantive difference. I mean, you can have, for example, parliamentary elections where someone breaks the expenses rule, but the election is not rerun because it's not seen as a big enough breach.
Right.
On the other hand, you can have elections where the rules are broken and the result is that another election is called. So those things can happen.
And of course, with
the national referendum, it's a different order.
Okay. And of course, with this recurrent emphasis on breaches of trust, so for example, with the breaches of data protection in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, is this increasing apathy amongst voters?
I couldn't speak to that, to be honest. I think that politics hasn't understood, people and voters, politicians themselves, haven't understood the full impact of the kind of micro-marketing that's now possible through sort of data crunching and targeting ads through social media. And I think that's an area that's to some degree unregulated and people don't really understand it. And worse still, it's a moving target. By the time you've passed a law against something, the techniques are probably so evolved that that law's too late. This is a generic problem with internet regulation for governments, is that they are, by their nature, quite clunky, slow-moving beasts, and by the time that they've decided to make something illegal, it's probably gone out of fashion and been replaced by something else.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's a serious thing right across the whole scope of internet regulation, whether you're talking about marketing or anything else.
Right.
So I don't know if it's eroded public confidence. I really couldn't speak to that.
Of course.
But it's a factor that people worry about more in politics. People like the Electoral Commission, people like the Information Commissioner are taking a very close look at this, and it may be that we get changes in the law out of it. As I say, it may be too late.
I mean, how are the government now going about fixing this and implementing possible regulations on internet data protection?
Well, one of the things we've got to watch out for is most of our data protection law actually derives from Europe, things like the GDPR, which is the thing that creates all those annoying consent notices that you get every time you go to a website, which has cookies on it. Our European legislation now, do we just sort of swallow that wholesale and continue doing that? Do we do something else? Interesting question. I'm not sure what the answer is. But again, it's an evolving area. I suspect that for years to come, every couple of years, there will be a new internet regulation bill of some kind trying to deal with the latest things that are going on the internet, because the law will keep on trying to catch up. Just as there's often a financial services bill every couple of years to cope with the wacky new innovations in financial services that come along.
Of course. Let's move on to something different now. Parliamentary privilege. What exactly is this?
Parliamentary privilege is, well, it's quite a number of things, really. It's the rights of Parliament that are needed to kind of facilitate its powers and abilities as a sort of sovereign body of the land. And one of those is the right to total free speech in the chamber. So you can get up and say, he's the guilty man, he's the one that did it, he should be punished in the Chamber of the Commons, and you can't be sued for libel.
Right. And of course there was a case recently entailing Lord Hayne, naming specifically Sir Philip Green in a harassment case. What exactly were the details of this case, and what were the issues surrounding this?
Well, we don't know the details of the case because they're protected by an injunction. Right. All we know is that Sir Philip Green is the defendant. I think some of the continuing reports of the court case are beginning to reveal
the details of the overarching case. So, for example, the actual action of Lord Hayne naming Sir Philip Green.
Yeah, okay. So the courts had ruled that Sir Philip Green was not to be named. The courts had upheld, temporarily upheld, non-disclosure agreements, which meant his name should not have been mentioned. And Lord Hayne took it upon himself to say, I name this man. He actually said very little more than that. Yeah. I mean, he was just on his feet for a couple of seconds. Now, the difficulty is that Parliament and the courts go to great lengths not to tread on each other's toes. Okay. So the idea is that parliamentarians don't use their free speech normally to cut across the rulings of the courts, or to make a running commentary on a live case before the courts. And the courts, for their part, stay out of the workings of Parliament. Right. Don't start trying to hand down rulings that they didn't do this vote properly, or something of that kind. Parliament has what's known in the trade as exclusive cognizance. Okay. That it's the only judge of its actions. Yeah. So basically,
that's attributed down to, of course, the principle of parliamentary sovereignty.
Yeah, well, I mean that's sort of a development of parliamentary sovereignty that goes back for centuries. But the difficulty of the interaction of the courts and this is that Sir Philip Green's case was in quite. I'm trying to remember, was it the appeal court? It was in a reasonably senior court. Yeah. And they'd been through a process that involved ludicrously high-paid QCs arguing intricate legal cases in front of a judge, and the judge had given the ruling. And Lord Hayne gets up in the House of Lords and sets all that aside because he thinks it's a good idea to.
Of course.
Now, I'm not saying he's right, I'm not saying he's wrong. What I'm saying is the courts are extremely irritated by this and don't think that it is right that that should be done, and want to try and get Parliament to put a procedure in place so that such things do not happen lightly. Now, they do happen from time to time. There's in the 2010 Parliament, there's a Lib Dem MP called John Hemming who made a bit of a practice of naming people in various circumstances for a while. But the courts really, really don't like it and think it's an affront to the rule of law. And if you're going to have courts making rulings, it shouldn't be possible, they argue, for an MP or a peer to just get up and set them aside with the flip of the wrist. So having some kind of procedure is something they're arguing for. And there's another layer to this, which is that it might be open to someone who's been named in that way to go to the European Court and say, under Article 6 of the European Declaration of Human Rights, that they've not been given a sort of right to fair adjudication by an independent tribunal because that's been blown away by parliamentary privilege. There have been cases of that kind before, and the European Court has basically ruled that that's the price you pay for having free speech in Parliament. Right. But there is a suggestion that they will want to look very closely at how Parliament handles these cases to make sure there's some kind of comeback. And if they think that Parliament's just saying, we won't let him have sherry in the Bishop's Bar for a week, or some sort of token punishment, they might feel that that's not enough. Okay. I can't speak for the European Court, I can't anticipate what judgments they might or might not make, but that is at least a possibility. And in that case, we're into quite an interesting constitutional area. Yep. So people are trying to work out some kind of mechanism where people go and talk it over with the Speaker or the Lord Speaker first and then see what they want to do. And if they go ahead after that, they're in trouble. But I'm not sure that either House of Parliament is up for restricting its own free speech like that. Now, this makes no judgment at all on the sort of Me Too stuff and the allegations against Sir Philip Green or anything like that. I'm talking purely here about parliamentary process. I don't know whether he's done wrong or done right. That's not what I'm getting into here. But the point about this is that there are, free speech is a powerful tool in Parliament, and the right to name the guilty men, as parliamentarians see them, is something they won't willingly relinquish.
Right. So, is it possible for these rights of right to due process and a right to freedom of expression to coexist in the future?
I think someone once had a line of, there's another parliamentary thing called the West Lothian question. So the best way to deal with the West Lothian question is not to ask it. Yeah. And if everybody just sort of tiptoes around and and is very careful not to step on each other's feet, then there isn't a problem. Yeah. And you don't have to try and come up with some kind of codified set of rules that may or may not restrict parliamentary privilege. And I think that's how a lot of the parliamentary authorities would like things to go. They just don't do this, and then we won't have a problem. But there are people who do it. And so you have to take it kind of case by case. But this is very, very high-power constitutional law. And one thing about the next few years is that Parliament is not going to have the time to make very, very high-powered constitutional law that doesn't have anything to do with Brexit.
Well, let's turn to something else, a lighter note, gambling. What's happened? What was the circumstances surrounding Tracy Crouch's resignation?
Well, Tracy Crouch was a minister who was very, very much committed to this idea of clamping down on what are known in the trade as FOBTs, fixed odds betting terminals, The mantra that gets attached to them is the crack cocaine of gambling. They're considered to be highly addictive. They're considered to be a factor in modern mental health problems. The government is planning to move rather slower than Tracy Crouch and others had hoped, and she resigned. And that's what ministers do when they don't agree with the policy of the government. If you're a minister, you are supposed to agree with every dot, comma, and tittle of government policy. No exceptions. You don't diss what other ministers are doing, or if you do it so delicately that you've got deniability. And Tracy Crouch was clearly very unhappy about that. And it was quite clear that she was considering resignation, and the rumblings carried on. I mean, an issue for the government in these kind of circumstances is: do they want to be seen to be pushed around by one of their own ministers at some point? But there are an awful lot of Conservative MPs out there who are concerned about this issue too, and some of them may well rebel on this. And I think it's highly likely that you'll get an attempt to write in a requirement for the government to move quicker on restricting the maximum stake on these fixed odds betting terminals in the finance bill, which will start through Parliament on Monday.
Exactly. I'd like to thank Mark Darcy here for his wise words on the activities of Parliament, and hopefully we'll see you on our next podcast on Unravel. Thank you very much, Mark Darcy. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Yeah.